Greetings. Welcome to a special edition of the Steve Deace Show here on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast, which means, of course, we are new, but we are not live. I am Steve Deace, he's Todd Erzin, he's Aaron McIntyre. You're going to be hearing more from them in the final segment of today's show. But first, before we get back to what we were just talking about, don't forget about our friends over at Moxie, because pest control sometimes can be, well, a pest, finding the right business for you. And that's where Moxie comes in. They set the industry standard in safety and expertise. That's why they've been doing that for 25 years, a trusted name in the business. How? Because they go the extra way and the extra mile when it comes to customer service. They are doing daily check-ins with their agents, making sure that they've got the latest technology, but also they're doing right by you from a customer service perspective as well. They want to help you love your home even more than you already do. So right now, you can help celebrate 25 years in the business for Moxie by getting your first pest control service for just $25. You can't beat it if you're out there on the market looking at costs these days. So you want to take advantage of this? Visit moxieservices.com/Steve, MOXIE, moxieservices.com/Steve. Use the promo code Steve for the deal. moxieservices.com/Steve, promo code Steve. We are pleased to go in depth by really one of the nicest yet bravest women I've had really the honor of getting to know and meet over the last few years. She co-hosts The Morning Wire over at Daily Wire, and she's also author, I think, of one of the most important works so far this decade when it comes to what is happening in the Christian church. Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda, was a bestseller back in 2024, and it made all the right enemies, and that list was long and unfortunately distinguished. Its author, Megan Basham, friend of the show, rejoins us today, and we are looking forward to going in depth with you today, Megan. It's good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good, and thanks for having me, Steve. It's always good to be here. That book, making the bestseller list, was in no small part to your effort, so I'm always grateful to be here because you were pretty much one of the first right out of the gate to say this is important, it's an important topic, and even before I wrote a book, you picked up on it and had me on when others didn't get it, so super appreciative.
Well, the least I could do, I've had a couple that have been pleased to have a bestseller myself, and one of them because a guy named Tucker Carlson put me on his show one night, so that certainly helps. So it's my pleasure to pay it forward, especially when it's a work as important as this. And we're going to get into you and getting to know you more personally. Obviously, you've got an ongoing health battle. We'll get into that as well, and who knows when this special edition will run. So that circumstance is, you and your family are still fighting through that. So we'll go through all of that, but let's start at the tip of the spear here, and this book, Shepherds for Sale, and take us back now and walk us through the origin of this book and when you first got the idea to write this.
Steve, I went over to the Daily Wire, I would say, though I maybe didn't know it at the time, to write this book, for the purpose of writing this book. And I didn't know it was to write this book, but I was at an evangelical news outlet, Christian mom, Christian wife, my kids are at a Christian school. And around 2019, I started seeing all of the wokeness coming into the church that so many other people witnessed. I know it manifested itself in different ways in all kinds of different churches, but the common experience was this sudden racialization of the teaching, that we were getting things that we knew were not coming out of scripture, but were coming out of progressive politics. And so, for me, the record scratch moment was probably when my own then church sent out an email informing parents after the death of George Floyd how they could talk to their children about their white privilege. And so, me as a mom sitting there, I went, wait, hold up, what's going on in my church? Mm-hmm. And then at work, suddenly seeing the massive Southern Baptist Convention denomination that I am a part of, the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., simultaneously adopting a resolution to use critical race theory as an analytical tool aside scripture. And so all of these things I was witnessing, just like so many of you were witnessing. And because I was working at an evangelical magazine, it was a little hard to go after some of the personalities and people that I thought I needed to report on and to get pretty aggressive in critiquing. And so when I happened to do an interview with Andrew Klavan, I was just sort of bowled over by the the portrait he painted of what the Daily Wire is doing and the fights that they want to take on. And I thought, that's where I need to be. So I just kind of on a whim asked him, hey, do you guys have any room for me over there? And it turned out they did. And
so you invited yourself, basically. That's what you did.
Right, yes. I did. Yeah. I totally did. And they brought me over to write about Hollywood, which I do a lot of. But I was like, listen, I will take this job and write about Hollywood, but I need you to let me write about the church too. Is that cool? And they were like, yeah, sure, absolutely. So, so then I got over there with this, just real sort of fire in my heart to cover these issues. And I started writing about Francis Collins, who was then head of the National Institutes of Health, and how he was using his friendships with highly influential evangelical leaders and ministries to coerce Americans, particularly American Christians, into taking an experimental vaccine that they didn't want, because he said they needed to do this to show that they love their neighbors. They needed to keep their churches shut to show that they love their neighbors. And so all of these things, started writing on it. You picked it up, others picked it up, it went viral, and then a publisher picked it up and said, hey, we think that there's a book here. And that was Regnery at that time. And they said, would you be interested in developing this into a book? And so, that's where it all came from.
One of the things, and we'll get into the specifics of the book and the aftermath, but as we're still kind of, setting the scene here, one of the things that I think made your book so devastating, and way more devastating than, say, if somebody like me wrote it. And I'm borrowing this from someone else who posited this theory. And by golly, if I could remember their name, I love to make sure I give people credit when I'm citing them. I cannot remember who came up with this, so maybe you will. And you can say, I did this evergreen with Steve Deace, and he mentioned he thought this was right on the money, because I'm stealing it from someone whose name I don't remember. Okay, but he made the observation that what makes this particularly devastating, as compared to if somebody like me wrote it, for example, is that in many respects, you represent the composite of what the entire contemporary evangelical church has based itself around in reaching. That this last generation of evangelicalism has been heavily matriarchal, has been heavily tilted towards women, that most of your major Christian music stations and networks have a Mildred, a Lois, a Linda, a composite of a Karen, of a female figure archetype that is their base audience. The kind of woman who the toughest challenge she's going to face today is, can I get the kids dropped off at daycare in time for my Pilates, appointment? Okay, that kind of stuff. Very uplifting, hope-filled, kind of very stereotype of what, frankly, people like Democrats would think suburban Christian women actually are. But that this is actually the archetype that is enforced in a lot of evangelicalism, and a lot of our churches as well. And things have got to be done in 38 minutes. We've got multiple service here, multiple campuses. We've got our kids in and out of the daycare. Things have got to move. You can't be the person in line at Mr. Mom doing it wrong. All right, everything's got to keep going. There cannot belabor points. Everything's on time. The men are all very passive and just do whatever Mama says. And when Mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. You represent this, right? I mean, you are an attractive, impossible not to like mom. Okay.
Do they know that? Do they know it? I feel they should know I'm impossible not to like, but somehow they didn't get the message.
You are the visage in many cases. If you had never written this book, there'd be a picture of Megan Basham in the program director's office of almost every contemporary Christian music outfit in the United States of America, right? And that this is what particularly devastated them, is that you are the visage of their archetype, and yet you came back and pulled their pants down in public and showed them their own heterodoxical views. And that's why in the past, even if John MacArthur, who endorsed your book, if he had written it, would have found its audience. They likely would have ignored it. It wouldn't have crossed into their stream. They would have acted like that's an entirely different ecosystem of evangelicalism. But because it was you, and who you represent, like a moth to a flame, sister, they could not stay away. They couldn't avoid elevating it and responding to it all the more, which gave it even more rocket fuel. What do you think of that?
No, I'm not positive who said it either. I think it was maybe John Harris. of Conversations That Matter podcast. I think I might remember that he's the one who said that. But I think that's exactly right. I mean, when you look at the model of something like the Gospel Coalition or that sort of Tim Keller third wayism, I'm the target, right? Somewhat, upper middle class, affluent mom who works part-time but works from home. I mean, I'm the person that they're supposed to be appealing to in this. And so I think you're absolutely right that maybe, part of the rancor that came was this was not supposed to happen to us from a woman like this. Mm-hmm. We were supposed to be protected because we try to appeal to women like this. Whereas, there's a growing number of women like me, Allie Beth Stuckey, Alisa Childers, Rosaria Butterfield, who are saying, no, actually, we don't want to be pandered to. We want scripture. And scripture says male headship. Scripture says men are to be leading in the church. So, we understand that we occupy an incredibly powerful, influential place as mothers and as people who influence other mothers. And that is good enough for us. When I think about when I was in Italy last summer, we went into the Uffizi Gallery and saw a statue of Constantine, Emperor Constantine's mother and wife. And the story was about how they influenced him for Christ and he became a Christian, and the rest is Christendom history. Mm-hmm. And I think about that's what we as women should recognize as our power. And instead you had so many of these evangelical institutions, and they're still saying it right now, just to be clear, saying, no, what we need is more women in institutional leadership. And keep in mind what that means is if you have women in institutional leadership, then they are by definition not at home. They're out of their homes doing institutional leadership. So these were the things that I was critiquing. And yeah, I do think that probably because it came from me, it was a little harder to ignore because I had a history in evangelical media, mainstream evangelical media at World Magazine. I had written for outlets like National Review, Wall Street Journal, so it couldn't just be dismissed as this is, the discernment bloggers, because that's what they'll do a lot is sort of go, they'll sniff. It's the divisive discernment bloggers. And, your average normie person at home who attends church on the weekends doesn't read those blogs and doesn't know that actually very frequently they have the correct information. And it's just that these ministries dismissed them because they're small, they don't have a lot of funding, they don't have infrastructure, and so they're really easy to blow off. And so suddenly when the Daily Wire started writing about it too, I think it became more difficult for these institutions that do this sort of thing to say, oh, it's just discernment bloggers. I mean, they've tried that now, but it's a little harder when it's coming from the Daily Wire and you have all of these other conservative media figures and outlets like you looking at the research, looking at the receipts and going, no, this is all accurate and you need to answer for it.
So you and I are theo nerds. So let's make sure as this conversation goes on, we define terms for people who actually have lives. Okay. So you used a term, third wayism. Define that for our audience real quick, if you could, please.
So third wayism is something that is very popular among the Gospel Coalition crowd, which is an influential evangelical media outlet founded by Tim Keller. For those who don't know Tim Keller, he has passed away now. He was an incredibly influential theologian and Presbyterian pastor. He established a very large church in New York, Redeemer Presbyterian. And really during a lot of the 90s, I would say early 2000s, he became very revered for being able to attract urban New Yorkers, upper class, professionals, young people back to church in Manhattan. Now, the way he did that was something that a lot of people call this third wayism as an approach. So when it came to politics, Keller would emphasize that, for example, the Bible is neither right nor left. Jesus is neither a Republican or Democrat. And so the idea is that we as Christians need to strike some perfect mean between the left and the right, and then we will be the third way representing Jesus, who is outside of politics. And what I would say to that is, to a certain degree, that's true. We do need a third way, but it's not in the middle. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say the third way that we need should be so far to the right that the Republicans won't have us. And that's really where Christians should be and frequently are, but it's not where you find their major institutions. They will speak out on abortion and they will speak out on the cause of life, but then they will try to pretend that something like our immigration laws are on par with the abortion fight to try to appease the left. So they will say we're a new kind of Christian who we're against abortion, but we also want to welcome the stranger and embrace amnesty policies, for example.
Now, the reason I asked you to define this specifically is not just because of when you said it, but to me, it's also a gateway drug to your book. Okay, because third wayism begins with, I would argue, a false premise that these are morally, equivalent sides. Okay, and that therefore there's no level of radicalism that exists on the left that doesn't have us cause for, stop and say, actually, Trump shouldn't have done that insult on Twitter last week. As if that somehow, listen, I'm not a fan of much of Trump's, previous Twitter insults, but somehow like that is as impactful as your kid getting medically kidnapped by your school guidance counselor. And he comes home and says, call me Shirley. And here's my binded breasts, Mom. How you like them apples? Right. That's essentially the false equivalency here, and that in many respects it was a canard. It was a shibboleth designed to create a structure by which they didn't have to actually confront the culture at all. There was one very well-known MSNBC host who was a regular attendee at Tim Keller's church for many years. And I used to wonder, how do you host a show on MSNBC and attend Tim Keller's church for many years and feel comfortable? Right?
Are we talking about Kirsten Powers?
Well, that's another one. But there was a second one as well where you would think you'd be. I mean, listen, I'm glad you're there. We want all the MSNBC hosts to go to church. But if you've been going there for many years and still going on television and saying the same stuff you were saying 30 years ago, that's kind of not the way this is supposed to work. Who's discipling who here, right? And that's kind of this sort of I would call it evangelical monasticism. All right. Now, in Keller's case, he built a cathedral in the heart of the city. But for most of these kinds of churches, they exist in suburbs, like where I live, affluent suburbs. They're evangelical monasteries. They're multi-campus, multi-acreage campuses. There's nothing happening there on Tuesday at 2 p.m. while the culture is literally going to hell and burning down, other than someone's just mowing the yard, of course, on a $5,000 rider, of course. And there's just nothing happening there. And they have a Pottery Barn feel, I should say. Everything is first class, but they are of no threat really to the forces of hell collectively on a daily basis at all. That's kind of what's come out of this third wayism, seeker sensitivism. My pastor wears a Hawaiian shirt even in January-ism. He wears a pleated khaki sweater vest in July-ism. The youth pastor uniform-ism, where he's wearing skinnier jeans than a high cost call girl would ism. That kind of stuff. That's kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yes. And by the way, just for fun, one of the big critiques that were sort of the gotchas that came out after my book came out, where Big Eva was trying to push back and saying, oh, she got some things wrong. One of them was that I said this particular megachurch pastor wears Patagonia vests. And, it was just a bit of creative writing about describing the person that you're writing about. And, he came out and said, I don't wear Patagonia vests. I wear, some other kind of vest that's Patagonia.
Imported cashmere. How dare you, sir?
Patagonia knockoff.
Yes.
I'm like, okay, you got me.
Yeah.
I was being funny. But, the reason I asked about Kirsten Powers is because that is a really important component of this third way thing. That part of it is also when they touch on politics, and it's impossible not to touch on politics if you're being any sort of pastor who is in any sort of way conscientious about your job. And I don't think Tim Keller was a lazy man. So of course he did deal with politics, but the way he did that was to sort of suggest that both sides are bad. So there's an equivalent there. Pox on both their houses. We have to just take bits and pieces from both sides. And what that did was completely try to deny the fact that, I have my issues with both sides, but one is manifestly evil. Like there's almost nothing anymore that the Democrat Party stands for that as a Christian you can in good conscience support. So they were not moral equivalents. You can't just say a pox on both their houses. And then part of how that has developed is you now have so many of these influential TGC, Gospel Coalition, again, apologists, theologians, fellows who are out now in that Keller mold. And what they do is they will condemn the act. For example, this horrific bill in Colorado that is going to allow that state to take away your children if you will not affirm transgender madness. What you saw from TGC, for example, some of their people condemning the bill, but they won't mention the party who's backing it. Mm-hmm. So who promoted this bill? Who sponsored this bill? Where did it come from? They don't talk about that. They just say the bill this particular policy is wicked, but we're not going to mention that it's coming from the Democrats.
I'm a believer, Megan, that what we call in the political industry I've worked in full time for the last almost 20 years. I'm a firm believer that progressivism, as it's known politically, is the great heresy. The great, lots of eras have very singular manifestations of what the Bible calls the spirit of the age. That doesn't mean there aren't other heresies or heterodoxies at work, but something that's very meta and unique to the era. And I think progressivism is our Arius, our Marcion, our Pelagius. It is the singular manifestation, concentrated manifestation of the spirit, the Gnosticism of the spirit of the age of our era. And that it has specifically manifested itself as a political philosophy, but it has all the hallmarkings of an ecclesiastical formation. The government is God, the state is the church, in that it is the place of formation of discipleship, morality, ethics, conduct, etc. And that the vast majority of evangelical churches in America have refused to acknowledge this. And so, I gave an analogy to a very prominent evangelical megachurch minister I had lunch with in my own state. And I said, your congregation is like if your ministry is like if you went to a place that was a place in Africa that was deeply influenced by the local witch doctor. All right. And the local witch doctor's down the street, and you go to another place in this village and you just set up shop and start doing evangelism, and then completely ignored that the local witch doctor has like a 40-year head start on you, that everybody in the village and community that you're attempting to reach with the gospel has been raised in the muck and mire of what this witch doctor is teaching. Okay. But you don't want to confront the witch doctor. You focus on the real thing, not the counterfeit. All right. And you're here, you're like in a hermetically sealed environment, and the gospel never has to actually, as a construct, confront the world system. The disciples essentially died for nothing. They could have found a third way. I even told them this. You could have found a third way. Maybe said, to Caesar, can we bow to you like at Thursdays only, maybe, and Jesus still gets Sundays. Something. And you're wondering why you're largely ineffective. People are coming en masse to hear what you have to say, but the village isn't changing. The lives of the villagers aren't that much different than they were before, because this stronghold, this dark spiritual stronghold of this witch doctor is still there, and you're letting him run unabated in the influence of the people of this village. And that's why no one's ever trying to arrest you guys or kill you guys, because in the end you're drawing huge crowds, but you're not really a threat. And I think that's how modern evangelicalism all too often has treated progressivism. They refuse. I can't tell if, and maybe you learned doing your book, whether they just don't want to because they want to avoid the consequences of understanding the signs of the times, or they just aren't able to. What's your take on that?
I would say it's two parts. And, that was a big part of the post-book hubbub was about my title, Shepherds for Sale. And what does that mean? Because some people came forward and said, every name in this book, then you should be able to prove that they took a bag of cash at midnight from George Soros at the train tracks, and that wasn't the case with every single person. But it was the case with some. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is that you have organizations like Christianity Today, its editor-in-chief, Russell Moore, people on its board who are open Biden supporters now. So they have to navigate it carefully because they've now welcomed the witch doctor supporters onto their boards. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the problem. And they are taking money from these progressive organizations. They're taking money from George Soros, from Bill Gates, from the Tides Foundation, from the Clinton Foundation. And they do this to partner in these sort of, you might call it elite organizations, these elite media events, things like with the Aspen Institute. So they want to rub shoulders with these very Tony people. And this is how they do it. This is how they become these sort of respectable voices who are not like those Christians. So they will say, we are not the culture warring Christians. And that's part of it. So, one, they want these, I would say, elite opportunities. They want to be in those rooms. They want to rub shoulders with those people. And then they also are flatly taking money to promote some of these things in churches. And I think both of those things are going hand in hand. And then the third way that they can that they can sell their pulpits, as you mentioned, is simply fear of man, in the sense that if they don't want criticism, then you're selling out by deliberately avoiding certain topics that you know are going to be controversial among a certain subset of your local population because they lean progressive. So therefore, you're not going to be John the Baptist confronting King Herod over his relationship with his niece that was inappropriate, incestuous, and sinful. Instead, they're just going to ignore it and say, hey, our place is not to be political. Our place is just to win souls. So, in that scenario, that is what they would have said John the Baptist should be doing. John the Baptist shouldn't have been confronting Herod. He should have just been out ministering to people and not being divisive and drawing attention to himself in that way. So, you can see that they're really not working from a biblical blueprint, but it's very much that verse that it has the appearance of power. It has the appearance of being spiritual, but it's not really spiritual, because when you actually look at scripture, what you see are these figures, as you said, confronting wicked political powers. And we don't see that today.
Hirelings, I got about 2 minutes here before we get to the first break. Hirelings or cowards?
Both. It's both. It's absolutely both. I would say further down the food line, it's the cowards who are also probably ambitious. So they're cowards who want to be in Russell Moore's place. They want to sit at the table and have a meeting with the Aspen Institute and the Atlantic Council. So, those are those guys. And then there's also the guys who just want to avoid the blowback from, their local community, their local news.
I'm a big believer that the previous era of the church took the second commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and made it the greatest commandment. And took the first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and essentially just ejected it. And that there was no higher law than the loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And human accommodation largely replaced faithful obedience in how we catechized and discipled in the last generation.
Yes, but only a certain kind of neighbor are we loving, right? Because as we just saw today, the Episcopal Church announced that even though it has taken millions and millions of dollars to facilitate refugee resettling from a lot of false refugees who claim to need asylum when they're not fleeing religious or political persecution, but they will not help South African white farmers who actually are fleeing persecution. So, fascinating that they're just outwardly saying we are not going to help these refugees because they're white.
But first, folks, there's only one athletic brand standing up for American values, free speech, and biological reality. That brand, XXXY Athletics. Men don't belong in women's sports. 80% of Americans agree, but too many people are too afraid to step up and say anything about it. Well, just wear it then. XXXY Athletics is the only brand defending free speech and the protection of women's sports. Their clothes are so high quality that when you wear them, you're making a statement, all right, that you stand for biological reality in our daughters and our wives and our granddaughters. XXXY Athletics has amazing logo tees, premium workout clothes, including leggings, moisture-wicking tops and tanks, tennis dresses, skirts, shorts, and so much more that you don't have to sacrifice fit, quality, and style to wear your values. So get started. What else would you wear? Head to thetruthfits.com, enter promo code BLAZE20 to get 20% off. That's BLAZE20 for 20% off only at thetruthfits.com. Again, the website you want to go to, thetruthfits.com, enter promo code BLAZE20 to get 20% off. If you're the old white boomer in that video the day that Trump got shot, sitting there in Pennsylvania, turning to the camera, screaming F-bombs, you're not the neighbor to be loved. Right. There's no outreach to you. No one's trying to reach conservative red state, godless conservative red state America. Nobody gets a cover shot on Christianity Seldom magazine or never. Okay, for doing that. There are only certain groups that, of course, even that very heresy of jettisoning the first commandment for the second. That only also applies to very specific groups as well that fit within a leftist hierarchy, and that's where I want to go when we come back. Because I want to start, Megan, with what it felt like to embark on this. And that it's all fun and games until somebody loses an eye, right? All right. So we'll get into that with Megan Basham when we come back here on this special edition. Don't miss it.
The Steve Deace Show.
All right, We're back here on this special edition with our good friend Megan Basham, author of the New York Times bestseller, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Absolutely one of the most important books written about the church so far this decade. And I mean, you got a designation that I did not get because the New York Times chose to give my spot on the bestseller list to Greta Thunberg, even though I sold 108% more books than she did during the same period. Not that I have that memorized and I'm very bitter about it. It just came off the top of my head. But I congratulate you, Megan, nevertheless, because the success is very well deserved, right? And so when the idea now to write this book, so you've done you've done the legwork leading up to this. You've been reporting on some of these things, and you have instincts. If you're where you and I are at, why this doesn't make any sense. There has to be reasons for why we're doing things that are clearly counterproductive to our own missiology. There must be something you're missing, right? So you go out, you start doing the initial investigative work to do it. You write pieces for one of the biggest alternative media sites in America over at Daily Wire. You start getting the notice of other alternative media places like our show and others, okay? And then they come to you and say, hey, we think this would make for a great book, right? And maybe at first you think I agree, it would make for a great book. But once the euphoria and the flattery of being asked to pen such a momentous work wears off, you begin to understand, I think, really how momentous this particular work could be, and therefore what will come with it at the exact same time. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. The spiritual and literal attacks came pretty quickly. Even before the book was out, we started getting first calls. There was calls to not my publisher because people mistakenly thought it was coming out under Harper Christian. In fact, it was coming out under their conservative imprint Broadside. So, some of these very large Christian ministries made calls to Harper Christian. And I'll just tell you, one of them was the National Association of Evangelicals and said, we have so many friends who have published books with you. It would just be so terrible to have a misunderstanding. Can we have a call with you to discuss what we're hearing about this Megan Basham book? So that was sort of my first inclination that, okay, they're organizing. They've heard the book's coming and now they're organizing in the background. I don't know entirely what happened. I will say I did end up at Harper Broadside after Regnery was sold because, I think there was some conflict of interest with J.D. Greer becoming a client of my former publisher. So I ended up having to move publications.
J.D. Greer used to run the Southern Baptist Convention, right? He used to be the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So he's a
very well-known, large megachurch pastor, president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He is very famous for pushing some ideas like pronoun hospitality. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this third wayism, that might be a good example of it as well, is that J.D. Greer, in the moment of this gender debate, said, well, the thing that Christians need to do in order to be loving is to go ahead and use those transgender pronouns to show that we're hospitable. So these are the kind of things that he would argue, and these are the kind of things that I obviously criticize in the book. And so, I know he made some calls. I know so some calls even went to my church and my pastor.
Wow.
Yeah, who kind of came and found me one day after church and said, I got some calls about what you're working on. He was great. I have a wonderful church and I'm thrilled, and they've been incredibly supportive. But he did chuckle. He said some guys from the Southern Baptist Convention sent me your Tucker Carlson interview, and they just kind of wanted to warn me about what you're working on. So, that was amusing. I know that happened a couple of times. And then eventually started getting the cease and desist letters from the National Immigration Forum over my reporting on its evangelical front group, which is backed by people like George Soros. It's called the Evangelical Immigration Table. Yeah. Huge, major ministries are involved with this open borders group, including the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which represents 185 Christian schools across the country, including schools like Biola that you probably think are very trustworthy. So, these are the kind of things that I was reporting on. And so that's why I started getting, not just that, but then the lawsuit threats. And every step of the way, all I can say is that, me as a little mom out here who thought, the Daily Wire is backing me, my publisher is backing me, but what I might very well be about to do is set fire to my career and any ambitions I have to doing anything in the future. So, I mean, I did become pretty aware that I might not only get sued into the ground if I get anything wrong, but I may make myself completely persona non grata among any evangelical circles. So that's kind of what I knew I was walking up to.
Let's pretend Todd is not listening to this interview right now and that our significant Catholic following has just completely tuned out for a second, all right? And we're just having a little internal dialogue, fellow Protestants here, okay? Nothing says sola scriptura, sister, like a magisterium of Southern Baptist insiders conspiring together in a private, off the books conclave to censor someone's attempt to hold them accountable to the scriptures. You know, you see where I'm going with this? I mean, irony. Your name is the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, come on, man. Okay.
Absolutely. And can I just say, I mean, and that's why I went, I didn't want to be, you know, a little self-inflated here. I didn't want to be self-delusional, but there was a moment where I really did start to see it as like the Blues Brothers. I'm on a mission from God here because, I mean, again and again, I really, you know, I was just kind of out on my own doing this, and I have these huge law firms, which, I mean, it was scary when those letters started to come, and I call up my dad and say, hey, have you heard of this law firm? And he's like, oh yeah, they're one of the biggest in the country. I know them. And I'm like, oh, great. Well, they're threatening me. You know?
On the other hand, you know that you're over the target, right? People say stuff like that to me all the time, and I'm like, well, you're not my wife and kids that deal with the repercussions of my name, bearing my name as I am over said target, okay? Just trying to live a normal life, right? So everybody gives you that as a compliment, and I know they mean well, but they're not the ones, you know, learning what the old saying that the excrement rolls downhill. They're not the ones learning in real time what goes along with that while you are over said target.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was kind of, you know, just sitting there, my husband and I discussing it going, I don't know. I mean, we could run through our savings here pretty fast if we get into some sort of legal battle with an organization as massive and well-funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars from left-wing billionaires like the National Immigration Forum, whereas I'm just over here with, you know, our salaries. So we're going to have to
On the other hand, the headline of them doing that would be devastating to them.
Correct.
Devastating.
Correct. And I gambled on that. I also I knew that I had the goods on them. I mean, I knew unequivocally that they were taking money from secular leftists in order to push open borders ideology and arguments and really legalistic teaching that takes the Bible out of context. I knew that they were doing this, and I knew that if I presented the evidence before a national audience, people would see it and people would respond, because I wasn't necessarily telling them something they didn't know. We all saw the church drifting to the left. We saw our leaders completely buckle when COVID happened. So it wasn't like I was writing about something where people would go, this is an absolute shock to me. It was more that people already knew it was going on. They just didn't understand why. And that's what my book did, was it provided an explanation of, look, here's what's been going on behind the scenes for years to explain what you're seeing. So, you know, to all of those respectable third way institutions, I would just say, look, my book wouldn't have sold like it did if people didn't already see what you're doing.
Exactly.
So I think it would have failed regardless. And, you know, we prayed about it and talked about it a lot and went, no matter what. And my husband, and I just want to say, I don't talk about him that often in regards to this, but he had my back 100% and was like, look, you need to write the truth. You need to unequivocally state what's been happening and be unafraid and don't worry, because if they ruin you, they can't ruin me. So, and we don't rely on your salary, so it will be fine.
You know, for people that don't know the history of your denomination, that's another great irony of all this. Is the Southern Baptist Convention is the only denomination in American church history that has ever at least flirted with liberalism and come back. And it happened, again, ironically enough, because there was a small band of dissidents, basically, like the late great Adrian Rogers, Judge Paul Pressler, and others. There was this small group of men, and they essentially did to the Southern Baptist Convention what your book does. I mean, they name names. They went seminary to seminary, congregation to congregation, and purged all the heterodoxy and all the spirit of the age simps right out of the denomination, just purged them all. This is the late 70s, early 80s. And after that, a reborn Southern Baptist convention became the dread of the spirit of the age for about the next 20 or 25 years, until purpose-driven life basically showed up. But that's the history of your denomination. Is the only reason it has survived as long as it has and has had the elongated period of influence it did, is because a group of men who now are regarded as heroes, now that they've passed away or they're in the elderly stages of life, but they did to your denomination essentially what you did, which is, hey, it's time to pop something right here. Let's pop the hood. Let's run a diagnostic here and let's figure out what parts here are faulty and not working properly, and let's get this fixed. That's what they did. It's just as tough as it was in their era, they didn't do it in the digital era. All right, where everything can be amplified both ways immediately in ways it could not when they were doing this half a century ago.
Yeah. And, I look back very much on that rare instance of the only time that a religious institution of that size has stepped up to the line of progressivism and liberalism and then backed off. And I mean, it was a brutal fight. And you're seeing, if you're paying attention, there is a very strong attempt happening right now to rewrite that history. So they are trying to rewrite the conservative resurgence as something that was bad, as something that shouldn't have happened. So you're going to watch that fight going on. And as we look to Todd, our Catholic friends, I always feel like I want to tell them, I'm like, look, you guys, you care what happens in the Southern Baptist Convention. If you are some other sort of Protestant, you also care, because it is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. Mm-hmm. It's some 43,000 churches, 15 million people. Now, if you could mobilize an organization of that size and magnitude for something good, you have a tremendous influence on American culture and American politics. But I would say, after the successful conservative resurgence, probably in the early to mid 2000s, we're starting that fight again. So the liberals have taken hold of a lot of SBC institutions. You can see that by virtue of their embracing critical race theory, how they responded to the COVID authoritarian moment. So many of them just completely acquiesced to that. You can see their embrace of Francis Collins and their push of feminism and just so many things. So it's happening again. And part of what I want to do is just alert people who aren't Southern Baptists, or who probably are and don't even know it, because I can tell you there's so many people in Southern Baptist churches who don't know that they're in a Southern Baptist church. And just tell them that, look, this matters to you. And if you're Presbyterian, it matters to you too, because there's a very good chance that your pastors are being educated in those Southern Baptist seminaries. So if they're teaching critical race theory, that's coming into your church too. And that's why we're seeing it, I think, all over again, this fresh fight, this fresh round of trying to hold off liberalism. Because, as you said, in the past, our fight was over really miracles. It was over things like Christ's divinity, the virgin birth. Now what you have are liberals who will say, we accede to all that. We agree. We affirm all of the basic orthodox points of Christ's divinity, how he was born, of the Holy Spirit, of the Trinity. But other things that Jesus said, moral law, they reject. For example, they will be LGBTQ affirming, or they will be pro-transgender ideology.
Red letter Christians. That's right. Another one. Yeah.
And I just think that so many of us need to realize that and stop fighting like we're fighting with fellow Christians, because the Bible tells us they're not. If you're in that Romans 13 devolution where you can no longer even understand the difference between a man and a woman, I don't think you can credibly claim to be a Christian, because your mind is clearly so darkened. So what kind of wisdom could be inhabiting it unless you just became a Christian 5 minutes ago? So, I mean, I think we just need to recognize that it's the same battle again. It's just happening on different turf.
Hey, before we get to all that, though, we are celebrating the birth of our nation here this month. We remember the heroes that fought for our freedoms. But some Americans today still are being denied the rights to life and liberty. And that includes too many unborn babies. And that's where Preborn's network of clinics come in. They provide free ultrasounds to women with unplanned pregnancies to not only help them save their lives of their babies, but to maybe their own souls in the process by not committing murder against their own children. And you guys have been so generous to make this happen. For as little as $28, you guys can fund a single ultrasound that doubles the baby's chance at life today. Some of you have more. You can donate $1,000, $2,000, $20,000, whatever it is, a widow's mite to something that a lot of other folks in our audience could probably not afford. All your gifts are appreciated. They're all tax deductible as well. So get involved today in the fight for life with our friends over at Preborn. Preborn.com/Steve is where you can go. That's donate now. Preborn.com/Steve. Got about 2.5 minutes before the next break. Let's fast forward to the end. We'll get into more of the meat of the book here in the next segment. But what did this do for your faith on the back end of this? Right after you went through this experience, you faced all this, all this pushback and blowback and everything else, and then you saw the success of the message of the book. I mean, what did this do in terms of reinforcing your faith?
So, I mean, when I took on the book, I first went, "This is a weighty thing, Lord. I am going to be out there criticizing pastors and major ministry leaders." And that's a heavy thing, and you want to do it very carefully. So, the first thing was I better get my spiritual disciplines in order because I don't want to be caught flat-footed. So I need to be in scripture every day. I'm listening to messages every day. So because you just feel like, look, I'm going to come under attack, and I better have all of my defenses up. And then the other thing was just the miracle of seeing God at every step of the way shepherd this book, so to speak, to ensure that all of these people who were working to prevent its publication or to prevent its publication in such a way that it gained any sort of audience, they were thwarted without my even trying. When the question of my first publisher dropping my book came up, when Regnery was sold, and suddenly I found myself without a publisher, and I know that these calls are going on in the background to warn all of these major publishers about me, and I'm feeling sick to my stomach for a couple of months. I mean, that went on. There was a period of a couple of months there where I had no publisher. I had a book, and I went, "Oh no, Lord, what now?" And I really didn't do anything. Just, the Lord just sort of dropped into my lap. A friend called, who herself has a couple of New York Times bestsellers, and said, "Hey, I heard what happened. I got a great agent. Let me just connect you with him. I don't know if he'll be interested. This isn't his sort of thing typically, but just talk to him." Well, the great agent picked me up. He got Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins interested. So suddenly the book was going to be on a much bigger platform than it was originally. And I did nothing for that. When the lawsuit started to come, a group stepped up and said, "Hey, we heard about that, and we want to ensure that you do not in any way feel that you can't speak freely and openly and honestly. So we want to cover the legal expenses of these threats that you're getting from the National Immigration Forum to sue you." So they just covered my legal expenses. They got me a lawyer. He handled everything. So just every step of the way, Steve, it was like they were not going to stop this book, not because of me, but because of what the Lord was doing. Amen. So I just kind of sat back and watched it happen.
Yeah, the Lord is rarely early, but he's never late, as you learned. Yes. All right, when we come back, we've got one more segment here in a special edition with Megan Basham. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. We're back here with hour 2 of a special edition of the Steve Deace Show here on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast. You'll hear more from Todd Erzin and Aaron McIntyre here in our final segment at the bottom of the hour. Until then, let us know what you think about what we think via the stevedeace.com inbox, which you can take advantage of by emailing the show, steve@stevedeace.com. That's DEACE. Like us on Facebook, MeWe, and Gab. You can follow me at Steve Deace Show on X, Instagram, and TikTok. Don't forget to subscribe to our new YouTube channel, at Deace Show on YouTube. That's at Deace Show on YouTube. And then finally, if you wouldn't mind, if you love the podcast version of the show, thank you. Please hit subscribe, or if you're on Apple iTunes, follow, and that'll make sure that every time we drop one of these new episodes, it drops right there in your feed every single time. And then also, if you like the show, leave us a 5-star review. And now, if you kind of like the show, we would absolutely ask you to exaggerate and embellish and just leave us 5 stars. If you don't like the show, we of course would not ask you to lie. All right. But we just don't want any average reviews. So if it's just, you're okay, we would ask you to exaggerate, but not lie. We want only 1 and 5-star reviews. That's what we're going for here. So thank you. Hey, I've got 2 questions for you, though, before we continue on with the show. Number 1, have you considered how your investments might unknowingly being used to fund policies that are anathema to your values? Are your hard-earned investment dollars being used to oppose what you just voted for in the last election? Well, if you voted yes to either one of those, maybe both, hey, you know that your investments should work as hard and align with what you believe in as you do. And that's where you want to go to our friends over at Constitution Wealth. If you're a conservative, if you're a Christian, what sets them apart from many other advisors, they can specifically screen investments for Christian values, ensuring your money supports businesses that honor God. So don't let your wealth unknowingly fund causes that oppose biblical truth. Get started with a free consultation today at constitutionwealth.com/blaze. That's constitutionwealth.com/blaze, and check out their disclosures at constitutionwealth.com. Remember, all investing involves risk, including the risk of loss. I am a client of the firm. This is a paid endorsement, but my opinions are my own. All right. And we are joined by our good friend, Megan Basham. She is the author of one of the bestsellers of 2024. And I think one of the most important books so far this decade on the church, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. All right. So this is the final part of the program we've got with you, Megan. So let's really get into trouble now. All right. Let's start naming some names. And you named kind of the, the Don of all of this in many respects, in this cat named Russell Moore. Mm-hmm. Now, I did not know much about Russell Moore. Back in the Bush era, I was a big fan of Eric Erickson and Red State, and I knew that they were tight. That's kind of all that I knew about him. When I first started doing this and started doing politics full time in 2006, I mean, frankly, the Gospel Coalition website was like a must daily visit, in preparing what I did for a living with a biblical worldview and then doing the show, and so the first time I started becoming aware that some of this was not right is I was one of the strategists for Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential campaign. And aside from my home state of Iowa, I also worked on evangelical outreach nationally. And the Southern Baptist Convention, under his Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the ERLC, they were hosting a debate for the Republican presidential primary in the fall, I think it was, of 2015 for 2016. But they only invited 2 candidates, and they were both Roman Catholics, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. So my old friend Mike Huckabee, who I backed in 2008, Southern Baptist minister, not invited. My candidate that I was working for, Ted Cruz, Southern Baptist, not invited. And the only 2 candidates that were invited to this forum for the ERLC were 2 Roman Catholics named Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. And I got to thinking to myself, what do these 2 guys have in common that they're getting invited to speak to the ERLC, but none of the rest of us are, including none of the other actual Baptist candidates? And then we found out it was because, they were for amnesty. Jeb was a longtime advocate of it. Rubio, probably the reason Marco Rubio will never be president of the United States is because of what he did with the Gang of Eight. If Marco Rubio never does that, if Marco Rubio sounds like he sounds right now, Donald Trump's never president. Ted Cruz never runs for president. Marco Rubio is a runaway shoo-in to win the nomination in 2016. All of history in the Republican Party changed because Rubio took the stage with John McCain and Lindsey Graham one day for the Gang of Eight. Okay, and that's why they got brought in to speak to the Southern Baptists as Catholics when none of the rest of us did, including the other Southern Baptist candidates. And that was kind of my first hint, late 2015, that something kind of smells rotten here in the state of Denmark. What about you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to pick, because I talked to a lot of people, and I was one of them who, prior to really 2019 for me, I would have considered Russell Moore a conservative, evangelical leader, someone who was representing us well on the national stage, but I wasn't really paying that close of attention to him. So as I said, I was, just a mom working at an evangelical magazine. And so we covered the major things. But when I started looking at the immigration things, I felt the same way you did. This doesn't make makes sense. Why are they doing this? Though I didn't really pick up on it until around 2019. And when I dug back into what you're talking about, those Gang of 8 years, that is really where you see that Russell Moore evolution into becoming a progressive figure. Because when you talk to his students, who used to be his seminary students, they will all tell you he was an incredibly conservative man at one point, to the point where he said that complementarianism, the idea that men and women have different but complementary roles, was not enough, and that he was a patriarchalist, which is insane to consider today when you see how very feminist he has become, to the point of endorsing books like Jesus and John Wayne from the progressive feminist writer Kristen Cobes-Dumais. So he's now endorsing feminists. How did that happen? And so that was one of the places where I showed, well, in this case, there was a financial incentive. So he was working with, as he was heading up the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the lobbying arm, the policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. These are the people who are going to Washington, supposedly, and telling the lawmakers and staffers, hey, we represent evangelicals and what they think. And so we're here to tell you this is how you should vote if you want to be reelected by these all-important evangelicals. And so that was really the point at which he started to shift to the left. And part of that was the money coming in from George Soros going to the National Immigration Forum, which is a known open borders left-wing group, and they created this evangelical front group right there in that 2013 to 2015 era called the Evangelical Immigration Table. But legally, it's the same thing as the National Immigration Forum. There's no separation between them. There's no separate funding. So it's the same group. So it's really just an AstroTurf front group. So that was when Russell Moore started working with them. And that is when he started becoming much more prominent as well, where you started seeing him quoted from CNN, and he became very known then as we moved into 2015 as this very prominent never Trumper. And that solidified his new identity, and I think is what earned him his entrance into the elite progressive camp of your CNNs and your Aspen Institutes and all of these places that you see Russell Moore and David French and the New York Times and et cetera turning up now. So that was really the evolution for Russell Moore. And I think at that time, a lot of people came along with him, people that we've already mentioned, like J.D. Greear, people who were kind of swimming in the same waters but in separate areas, like Tim Keller, because I think part of it was the idea that the world was never going back. And we as Christians have to learn how to adapt and thrive in this culture that is just going to continue to move to the left. They never really considered what might happen if the country became more conservative. So I think they were caught extremely flat-footed by that. And you're still seeing that play out.
Nothing says not even the gates of hell will prevail, like we're never going back.
And that is, when you come up to today, when Russell Moore left the ERLC, so because he was such a never Trumper, because he became so progressive on so many of these issues like immigration, to the point where they even opposed the Trump administration putting a temporary pause on immigration from 7 Muslim minority nations where there's known terrorist activities. They said, hang on, we need to get a handle on that situation. Put a pause. Russell Moore, Tim Keller, all of these other leaders came out strongly condemning the president's actions in that case. And that was something that didn't represent Southern Baptist views. Same thing when he came out and supported building a mosque in New Jersey where the community didn't want it. He was using Southern Baptist influence and claiming that he had the backing of Southern Baptist constituents to say, hey, we as the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., we want to see mosques built in New Jersey. We want to bring in all kinds of Islamic immigrants. And we want to see what we're seeing on the streets of England and Germany now. So these were the things that they were arguing. And it was very out of step with the rank and file of Southern Baptists. So Russell Moore was eventually pushed out, and that's why he landed at Christianity Today. And I go into a lot of intrigue in the book into how it happened, because Russell Moore didn't just leave quietly. He didn't just say, look, I'm moving up to bigger things. I'm buddies with people at the New York Times now. David Brooks and I are in the same book club, which is something that he does brag about. But suddenly he's now in this position, And you see all of these people saying, well, wait, he's changed. And he's trying to explain how he hasn't changed, but it's obvious that he has. And in the meantime, he is now setting up an explosive bomb. And I mean, this goes deep in the weeds, Steve, of a false claim of a sexual abuse crisis in the SBC. So this was the way he was going to destroy the denomination that rejected him for becoming left. So if you enjoyed that kind of reading, there are parts of the book that become very juicy when I describe the intrigue that went on behind the scenes. But at that point, he leaves, and he doesn't exactly commission, but in a sense does, his second in command, his chief of staff, Brent Leatherwood, to take over. And Brent Leatherwood is essentially just following in the same footsteps of Russell Moore in terms of immigration and amnesty. He's still a part of this Evangelical Immigration Forum. They're still pushing open borders in the name of Southern Baptists. So there's still a lot of controversy surrounding that. But, I would say, to get to your question, when you look at these names, these are the people who are still doing this. Russell Moore at Christianity Today, Brent Leatherwood at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. J.D. Greear has gone somewhat quiet. I think probably his influence has dwindled based on some of these progressive positions that he took, and he's maybe now trying to reposition himself. And then you have people who are still in their positions of power, and everyone has just sort of tried to pretend like what I wrote about didn't happen. And that's someone like President Danny Akin at one of the largest seminaries in the United States, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. They pushed critical race theory. They pushed the open borders. They pushed climate change, just all of these progressive priorities. And what they've done is essentially just erase it. So they've taken those things off the web. But, I mean, you can still find them. They're still cached in certain areas, but they're just trying to pretend like they didn't do that. But overall, when I look at it, Steve, I think we have something positive happening in that even guys I don't trust, who were very squishy a few years ago, are now trying to reposition themselves as, no, we're conservative now. So, the Russell Moores going in the direction they have, that's been damaging, but I think per God's design, something more positive is happening, and that is that so many people see what was going on now, that trust has been completely destroyed in those people, and you're actually seeing so much of the church become more conservative because they realize now that they've been lied to.
What was the name that you were the most personally disappointed by as you were doing this and you thought, oh no? Not him too. Come on, man. Who was it? Yeah,
there was a number. One of them that was tough for me was D.A. Carson. I have a tremendous amount of respect for D.A. Carson.
Yep.
He's done tremendous work, but he had endorsed a book. I want to try to make sure I get the right one. It was one of the Revoice authors, which if you're not familiar with Revoice, it's an organization that's sort of promoting soft acceptance of gay identity in the church. So I would say it's getting that camel's nose into the tent of LGBTQ affirmation. And he endorsed a book that was very much a part of that pro-Revoice movement. I mean, it kind of crushed me to have to write about that because I love D.A. Carson.
I've cited him on my show over the years several times. Yeah.
Right.
What one generation believes, the others will. What one generation believes, the next will receive, and the third will reject. I've cited that to my audience many, many times. That's D.A. Carson. Yeah.
And so, it was one of those things that I just had to include. And look, it goes to the point that I don't think every single person in my book should be anathema. I mean, there are some of these guys who I think are absolutely disqualified. They don't belong in a pulpit. They don't belong at the head of a ministry. They should just absolutely be removed. There's definitely a lot of those. But there are also some guys who I will give some grace, who I think got caught up in some cultural moments. I think they should acknowledge it and repent, but I don't think they're disqualified because they didn't promote it to a deceptive degree that you saw like the Russell Moores do or the Ed Stetzers do. Like if you look at something like Francis Collins.
Oh, Ed Stetzer. Oh yeah, our audience. I made our audience very familiar with Ed Stetzer. Yes.
Well, so you have those guys who I think are, they've deliberately sidled up to powerful institutions and people, and they will be more than willing to promote their messages if they think it will benefit them personally. I think you have those guys, but I also think you have some guys who just kind of got caught up in the worldly wisdom. And, I kind of look at like Nine Marks, if you're familiar with that ministry, that's a little similar to TGC. Some of their people put out sort of pro Black Lives Matters comments. I think one of them marched with Black Lives Matters or something like that. And I look back at that and I go, that was foolish. But it was foolishness in a moment. I don't see a record of you trying to promote this progressivism in the church. So I kind of hold different categories.
Has anybody repented?
Not really. It's been more repositioning. I would say I've seen people reposition it. Well, Josh Howerton, if you're familiar with him, he's a young pastor who's becoming very well known. He is someone who is maybe the only example that I can think of who is a pastor with a large church, large following, who has come out and said, you know what, I got it wrong then, and here's how I got it wrong, and here's what I think now. And I have incredible respect for that. Andrew Walker, theology professor, prominent writer, professor as well. He is another one who I think came out and said, I overstepped my bounds during COVID. I went too far on what I said people should do, I think regarding masks or vaccines. So there's been a couple of people like that, but they're very few and far between. And most of what I have seen is people trying to deny what they said, even though it's in black and white. And I can point you to the context. I can point you to the interview. I can point you to, the URL in New Yorker magazine where Tim Keller said the things he said, and yet you still have his defenders trying to say he wasn't anti-Trump. Tim Keller wasn't down on Trump supporters, which is ridiculous, because if you read what Tim Keller wrote, and look, I too benefited from Tim Keller. I mean, people are taking this as I'm saying Tim Keller was a heretic and no one should ever read or listen to anything he ever did anymore. And that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that he definitely lost the plot in the later half.
But first, in these unprecedented times, don't have time to wait for Todd. Make sure that you've got an agent that knows how to navigate what's gone on in the real estate market since the last time we had one of those, which was like the fall of 2019. So it's been a minute. Lots of things have changed, not just the escalating interest rates. Lots of things you need to know you probably don't. And then there's the things you don't even know you don't know. That's where you want an agent you can trust to help you navigate these murky waters. You're going to find them where the name says it all. realestateagentsitrust.com is where you can go. That's realestateagentsitrust.com. And there, we're going to hook you up with an agent that likely is from this audience, so you share the same values as them, but also has a verified track record of success. Otherwise, we wouldn't be recommending them to you. So whether it's just across town you're trying to get to, or maybe even across the country, make sure where you really get is across the finish line with a win in what can be a stressful process, even when things are going great, unlike now. realestateagentsitrust.com is where to go. That's realestateagentsitrust.com. I mean, I had a good friend of mine call me last year. He was going through some tough times in his marriage and trying to get reconnected with his faith. And he told me what he's reading, and he said, well, I'm reading this book by Tim Keller. And there was like silence from my end of the conversation, and he could sense the tension. He goes, don't worry, I checked, and it was written before 2006. I said, okay, then you should be good. Yeah, you should be okay then.
And that's true. And I mean, I even
listen. There are some people like Beth Moore and others that should just have allowed Donald Trump to break their brains. There's just no other way to put it.
And they don't appear to have any intention of coming back. I mean, you have David French, who went so far in hating Donald Trump that he got to the point where he said the mutilation of children, what has been happening, should not be considered child abuse, that the state of Texas
he's literally a professional slanderer of the brethren, is what David French is now. And for people that aren't old enough to remember this, he was the hardcore culture warrior at National Review. When you and I were growing up, he was the hardcore guy. He was the hardcore culture warrior. Now he's a professional slanderer of the brethren. I mean, he just allowed Donald Trump to break his brain.
I was going to say the man was like so far to the right that at one point he wrote a defense of the Confederate flag that I went, I don't know that I'd go there, but I still respected him. And so I read the essay, but he would never write something like that today. Anyway, I think that those are the different categories of what has happened since then. And, I would characterize them as extremely disingenuous and rather silly critiques of the book that almost exclusively came from people associated with these ministries. So,
like what's your favorite one? What was your favorite one?
My most I'll be honest, my most irritating one came from Neil Shenby, who is a member of J.D. Greer's church. He's a big defender of him. And he's known as being someone who is anti-critical race theory, but I have argued he should not be known for that because he actually supported the critical race theory resolution at the SBC in 2019, and a lot of people don't know that. So I kind of go, it's hard to be known as the expert against critical race theory when you actually supported the implementation of critical race theory in practice. But, he wrote a long review.
Tomato. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Well, basically, he said, well, she didn't call up the people whose public comments she quoted to make sure that they meant what they said. And they're now telling me they didn't mean that. Well, I'm like, that's not how journalism works. Okay. The man said this. It was public commentary. It was public content. I am free as a journalist to interact with that public content and interrogate it. And so that was sort of ridiculous to me, this suggestion that, from people who don't understand journalism, who think if you quote anything, you have to go and make a call to that person. And that's not actually how it works. It's if someone's creating public content, you're free to interact and quote that public content. So, that was part of it. From people who just straight out denied that Keller had a document that he wrote where he said in the coming spiritual renewal, he had categories of people who could work together. And the third way people, the moderate people in the middle, the people who are somewhat conservative and only maybe slightly pro-Trump, like maybe the people who held their nose and voted for him, you could work with them, but you cannot work with unabashed Trump supporters on this project of spiritual renewal, that they will not be valuable or productive in that project. So that's pretty anti-Trump to say that I don't think Trump supporters can be a part of the project of America's spiritual renewal. And people were just straight out denying it. And I didn't know what to do about that other than say, read the article where Tim Keller made these comments. Read the articles where he said that Christians supporting Donald Trump are making it harder for the church to evangelize. I mean, these are the things that he said, and you can't get away from that. And so those are probably the most irritating reviews to me, where people said, well, yeah, they said it, but they didn't really mean it.
Did Tim Keller say that before or after he segregated his church by vax status?
Right. Yeah. No, that was before he did that. So he made those comments about Trump around in the first election, 2016. And then, yes, Redeemer.
So he was concerned about Trump's serrated edge, maybe giving rise to a certain kind of white nationalism that the right had pretty much put down since the Democrats abandoned segregationism in the 70s. He was so concerned about that he decided to practice segregation.
Right, exactly. So they
makes perfect
had
sense.
A vax and just to land on that for a second, the most bizarre thing about the segregated by vax status thing that Redeemer Perez was doing during COVID was that unvaxxed children could sit with their parents on the floor, and all the unvaxxed people, if you couldn't show you were vaxxed, you had to sit in the balcony, except for the children, which is insane. That shows you that it had nothing to do with health measures, because children could transmit the virus. So anyway, just bizarre things like that. And, having to point out to people that, look, Tim Keller participated in a meeting in, I think it was 2018, with some other church leaders, where they were trying to figure out what to do about the problem of Donald Trump and the fact that Christians are supporting him. So that's a meeting that they had and that he participated in. And so these are the kind of just hard records that you've seen some of these critics trying to deny. And then they will say things like, my opinion of Tim Keller saying this. So I will write that Tim Keller said this. And then I will write that my analysis is that Tim Keller considered Donald Trump supporters beyond the pale, because he essentially said he did. And then the critic, Neil Shenvi, will say that was an error. Megan Basham said Tim Keller believed that Donald Trump supporters were beyond the pale. Well, no, that's my opinion. That's my analysis. It's not an error. So, that was just a big, but I would say largely failed attempt from some of these ministries to try to take down the book and try to discourage people from reading it. And I think it probably worked in some cases, because I do hear from readers who tell me that they approach their pastors and try to get them to read the book or consider what's in the book, and their pastors will not even read it. They just say, I've heard that's the kind of thing that I shouldn't give my attention to. Or I've heard that, this is just a divisive book. So they're not even reading it and giving it the attention that I feel it deserves. Because I'm like, look, you don't have to buy my book. You don't have to read my book, but at least consider the evidence.
Nothing says Reformation quite like a few insiders told me I shouldn't read that, so I won't.
Right. I mean, I literally watched
this stuff
interview.
These jokes just write themselves at this point. It's like Steve, the third one. Yeah.
I watched an interview between a Gospel Coalition writer and a Gospel Coalition editor, where they both sat there and admitted they hadn't read my book. They both said it's not the kind of thing they thought they should give attention to. And then they proceeded to spend the next 10 minutes opining on what they think is in the book and why it's probably wrong. So, I mean, I don't know what to do with that. I'm like, look, if you guys aren't even going to read the book and you're not going to have me on to actually discuss what's in it, and I'll defend and debate it all day long, they don't do that. So they're just doing these little side podcasts where they sit there with each other and go, well, it's not the kind of thing I would want to give attention to, and then admit that they've never read it.
All right, we've got 4 minutes left. We don't know when this is going to run. We always say about these special editions, we don't know when they'll run, but something tells us that Providence will make sure they won't run right when they're supposed to, right? So you have been, for the last year or so, fighting quite the health battle. And it's not over yet, So again, we don't know when this will run, but I just wanted to make sure we had a chance to address that, let you say anything about it that you wanted to say. I know you were private about it for a while and have come out publicly about it in the last few months. And there's a lot of people praying for you and just where you are, where your family is, etc.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, who don't follow me on Twitter, so right around Thanksgiving, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer. So that's an advanced diagnosis. And I had a couple of additional issues that made me a little bit higher risk too. So right now I'm going through chemo, big chemo as I call it, because initially I went through 28 days of chemo radiation, which is where you just take chemo pills and you go and you get radiated every day. So we're through that part of the process. We are now almost done with chemo. It hasn't been too bad. This is my off week, so I'm feeling good. And just really praying and hoping that this completely kills it and that it obliterates it and God takes it out of my life. But at the same time, look, he's brought some interesting things into my life in the last few years. And I can't look at a year where I went, man, Lord, I had both a New York Times bestseller and then 2 months later found out that I had advanced stage 3 cancer. Obviously you are in these things and this is a heck of a roller coaster ride, but I've known through everything else in my life that I can trust you and I can trust you with this wherever it heads. So, I'm doing some additional therapies. For those who are asking, yes, I am doing the ivermectin because I see no reason not to. And so we're just, we're walking forward in faith and so appreciative of the prayers. And I know that one of the first people my brother-in-law told, because he's an enormous fan of yours and will be thrilled when I say that John Brannon, my brother-in-law, told you that I had cancer. And with even before you mentioned to your followers who I was, I saw you putting out the prayer requests for me. And, those were dark moments. And it was before I had told anyone. So seeing that out there was really meaningful to me. And, my husband and I cried some tears over just, seeing these anonymous prayers being lifted up on my behalf. And now people openly praying for me. So we're just incredibly appreciative.
It's all very well deserved. And I've said this to you several times privately, but let me close our part of the conversation today with you by saying it to you now to your face publicly. Well done, good and faithful servant. And you have done a tremendous, a tremendous benefit to the church in general. And I am quite confident none of us will fully understand the breadth of it until you reach eternity. And you get to hear your master say that to you directly. And we wish you and your husband and your family nothing but the best. You are a tough little church lady, man. Okay. So, and I mean that in the nicest connotation possible. And we can't wait to have you back again. And as often as you're willing to be here, Megan, thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. You guys have been my warriors.
You bet. Thank you. Take care. God bless you. Okay.
You too.
All right. When we come back, there is a lot of meat on that bone. There is a lot we could talk about. And Todd and Aaron have been sitting here as they always do with these special editions, dutifully listening alongside all of you. We'll get their thoughts and feedback here in just a moment. Stay tuned. right, now is the time that we get some reaction to the conversation that you just heard with best-selling author, co-host of The Morning Wire over at The Daily Wire, and just all around cool chick, as Todd likes to say, Megan Basham, looking at her momentous work, whose impact will be felt for years to come. And of course, now she's in her own battle as we speak. We don't know how that will turn out. But you can just see, I mean, just the toughness and poise by which and the grace at the same time by which she is able to model those three traits in the midst of two tumultuous storms. I mean, taking on a shibboleth of the damned, Joan of Arc style, and then taking on a great battle over cancer at the exact same time. I mean, she is a tough little cookie, man, no doubt about it. And she had a lot, I think, of meaningful things to say. So Todd and Aaron, it is now your turn. You listened along with the audience, and what stood out to you?
There are schemers everywhere. Good Lord. I mean, you asked that question about, hey, has there been anybody who's repented? And she brings the receipts in her book. Has there been anybody who's repented? And what did she say? No. More of a repositioning. That's just scheming. That's just scheming. The third wayism, there's parts of the left that will take, the parts of the right that will take, and then there's parts of both sides that will eschew, and right up the middle is the third way. No, that's called fence sitting. I can't remember. The first person I heard say this was, I think, Jan Michelson on WHO Radio, who's one of your mentors when you were coming of broadcasting age, I should say. Only thing you get from riding the fence is a sore crotch. And that's kind of what, at least in the case of the Southern Baptist Convention right now, that's kind of what they got. I mean, for pursuing this third wayism, all it's done is just expose a lot of people as phonies, cause a great deal of mistrust, and cause a lot of schisms. Now, can that be constructive? Megan seems to think that, yes, there are some good things happening in the Southern Baptist Convention, specifically that enclave, and I pray that's true, and that will come to fruition. But I mean, this goes all the way back to, this goes over a decade ago, where we really started to see these fissures, these fault lines, if you will, in evangelical institutions in this country. I remember, who was the guest that we had on earlier this year to talk about Ed Stetzer? I think it was Seth Gruber.
Seth Gruber, yeah.
And in preparing for that, I went back through my personal email, which is the email I largely used at my last job, which was the last full-time job before I started working for you a decade ago, to just see what I had seen, to just see what interactions I'd had with Ed in the past. And I stumbled upon this interview. This was back in 2015, early 2016, about, I think it was Campus Crusade for Christ, cozying up to Black Lives, or no, it was InterVarsity, not Campus Crusade. InterVarsity cozying up to Black Lives Matter and having to, kowtow and tiptoe around and do a PR campaign to clarify where they stood on racialism. This stuff is not just recent, like within the last 5 years. This goes back a long time. And I read recently what causes people like the David Frenches, the Russell Moores of the world, what causes them to go over to the dark side? And I don't think it's up for debate. In those two specific cases, they have chosen something they have chosen a very dark path in their lives. As you mentioned, David French's job title is Slanderer of the Brethren right now. There's this ever-present temptation, I think, when you reach a certain point, maybe in your career or ministry, this temptation, and it's always, I think in any walk of life, if you're trying to navigate this as a believer, there's always the temptation of wanting to fit in, of wanting to be one of the cool kids, of wanting a seat in the inner circle. And I can't remember again who posted this, but he said, these temptations come on without you even realizing that they're there. And he issued one example in his own life. He was at Harvard working with some professor who had made his bones as an ethicist with just war theory during Vietnam. And this professor, purporting to be a Christian, made a joke about the resurrection of Christ being metaphorical and not literal. And he said, the professor looked at him to see if he had laughed at his joke, and he did not. And he realized that was one of the opportunities, that was a temptation of being invited into the inner circle. Just one thing like that. And you have to wonder what forces without or within the church, by and large, the Protestant church in the United States, what forces were there that were always luring? Of course, we always know who the enemy is. Of course, he is there. He is deceiving and tempting all of the time. But who were his instruments over the past 15 to 20 years to try to lure some of the leadership? And it just befuddles you, but it makes you all the more grateful for workers like Megan. And I say worker, not writer, worker. She put in the work for this to expose some of these just dastardly deeds. Makes you thankful that we're exposing these now. Because if it weren't, if these workers of lawlessness and fruitlessness, if they were just allowed to go unabated, I mean, they would be contorting themselves, repositioning themselves into a pretzel over and over again. At least now there's an opening, an opportunity for true leadership to show up and to show out and to point the way forward into a realm of clarity. Because what's not going to work in the future, I don't care what eschatological preference you have, because this gets into eschatology. It always does. I don't care what eschatological preference you have. If your mindset is the culture's always just going to go, keep going left, 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 there's nothing we can do about it, that is a loser mentality. That is contrary to the scripture. And nothing says, I don't really believe that I serve the living God, the most powerful being in the universe, more than that inclination. And you heard Megan say that towards the beginning of the interview. That's really what's driving a lot of this. Is this false sense that no matter what we do, the culture is just going to go left, so we got to make our peace with it. No, never. If that's you, what are you even in the game for? So there's a real opening right now for leadership. Thank God for people like Megan in particular, for naming names. Because the first step in admitting you have a problem, or the first step in actually solving a problem, is admitting that there is one. And it's rife right now within certain sectors of evangelical institutions in this country. So thank you to Megan. Great work. She did the thing. It wasn't just blogging. It wasn't just opining. She did real work here. And I think we're in a debt of gratitude to her.
Amen. Amen to every word, man. That was very well said. Todd, what say you, man?
Well, Megan started off talking about how, this isn't about resentment. It's actually about calling men forward, because I just want the Bible, and the Bible is clear. Men are expected to lead in the home, in the church, etc. And I think underlying all of this, in the Trump derangement syndrome that you talked about, and broken brains, and Megan's been given eyes to see clearly that underlying all of this confused, compromising theology and leadership has to do with a very confused and compromising self-image of what it means to be an actual man. And that has become very soft and lackluster way before Donald Trump ever came on the scene. We are not, you as men, no, pastors, whoever, we're not supposed to be tame lions. And this is why Donald Trump ultimately was the thing that just exposed so many things, because he has many faults, but he is far more classically a man than many in this culture. In his sins and his good qualities. His sins are just like this decadence, this brashness, the going too far, taking too much risk, liking women too much. That's a tale as old as time. this is a very, very new sin. This notion that and David French will tell you, I'm nicer than Jesus. That kind of stuff is what men had already become before Donald Trump came along, and he was just like a steroid shot that took all of the problems that were brewing and percolating in the Southern Baptist Convention, and then put him on steroids, because they're basically, he's the other. And the way they do, think, say, and feel must be opposite. That's no different than the secular leftists. Why do many of them endorse crazy things like transgenderism? Some of them are absolutely neck deep in actually believing it. But most of them, honestly, it's just because the Christians think it's bad, so they have to hate the Christians. And that's really what a lot of the people that she had to write that book about is because, could you just be an actual man? We can tolerate. I know sins are going to come from everybody under the best of circumstances, but she needed to be step up in the plate. Almost, she's a version of Moms for Liberty. You won't do what needs to be done. You're always doing the safety dance. Not after you dance around in your pleated khakis and you're so proud of them, and then you get the bedazzler out and you go to work with them to kick it up a notch. It is really a fundamental lack of manhood. I believe that has fallen down more than the actual theology. Aaron it does a great grace to remind, how much Pope Francis frustrated me. He was just a bad pope. It doesn't mean he was an evil man or anything like that. But Aaron has reminded that in terms of the leadership, how much formally, in terms of the actual teachings of the church, changed under Pope Francis. And in terms of dogma and doctrine, nothing. But he was very, very confusing. I get the feeling, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot is probably the same within the formal laid out teaching, whatever way they publish that, guys. It's probably the same now in many respects within the Southern Baptist Conference as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But it's been led by feckless men. Am I accurate in that? Both of our churches have the same problem?
No.
Yep.
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
I think there's been far more change within and I'm not, whatever the term you want to use for it. I think there's been far more schisming on doctrinal grounds amongst the churches and Protestant world that you're talking about than there has been necessarily from the.
Well, has it been more than talk? Have they formalized it?
I mean, I'm sure I could find examples, but just off the top of my head, my gut instinct says, okay, there are churches that are wayward now that were not 20, 30 years ago. But in terms of, overall, if you're talking specifically about SPC, give or take, it's pretty much the same as it was the last 20 or 30 years, probably closer to threatening core doctrinal differences than ever before, or core doctrines, I should say, than ever before. But I see the point that you're trying to make.
It's just equal measures. As big as there might be theology problems, it's just a man problem. And that's why she had to step up and write this book. She's a mom for liberty.
Hey, before we get to all that, though, we are celebrating the birth of our nation here this month. We remember the heroes that fought for our freedoms. But some Americans today still are being denied the rights to life and liberty, and that includes too many unborn babies. And that's where Preborn's network of clinics come in. They provide free ultrasounds to women with unplanned pregnancies to not only help them save their lives of their babies, but to maybe their own souls in the process by not committing murder against their own children. And you guys have been so generous to make this happen. For as little as $28, you guys can fund a single ultrasound that doubles the baby's chance at life today. Some of you have more. You can donate $1,000, $2,000, $20,000, whatever it is, a widow's mite to something that a lot of other folks in our audience could probably not afford. All your gifts are appreciated. They're all tax deductible as well. So get involved today in the fight for life with our friends over at Preborn. Preborn.com/Steve is where you can go. That's donate now. Preborn.com/Steve. I've asked myself a lot during this era, What is it about Donald Trump that causes people to lose their minds? And I just think, given the evidence we have now, I mean, the time we're taping this, it is May 12th, 2025. Who knows when this runs? But that's more than a decade of exposure that I've gotten to Donald Trump, because I started talking to him right after the 2012 election. But we're about almost a decade to when he came down from that escalator to announce his presidential campaign. And I just think you know what I think it is? I think there's just, God has decided he's going to raise him up and use him for the exposing of a lot of things that needed to come to light. Because I just don't believe in the natural. A human being causes this many people to just decide to out themselves. You see what I'm saying?
Completely.
Or decide to break their brains on his behalf. Right?
Yeah.
And because if you noticed, since his foray into public life at this level, many of the things we were concerned about or suspicious of have accelerated on steroids in confirming those concerns and suspicions in the most blatant and obvious of ways. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I just think you have to come to the conclusion that there is some form of anointing on him, that the Lord is using him to expose, to bring these things to light that have been in the darkness. And we see that happen routinely. I think it also explains why there hasn't been a lot of repentance about things that people were wrong about, too. You know, I had to admit I've been wrong about several things over the years, including, you know, at least to some degree, Donald Trump. Okay. You know, and I mean, in 2015, I would have been in conversations on behalf of the Cruz campaign with ministry leaders. You know, we can't have this guy win. He would be a bad influence, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But, you know, I noticed that a lot of those those leaders I was talking to in 2015 did not go with us, but went with the softer candidates. You see what I'm saying? Meaning that their concerns, I realized, were not the same concerns that I had. Okay. And it's been very clear that some level of pruning has been going on here, and Donald Trump has been the threshing tool in the hand of the Lord to some degree to expose many of these things and bring them to light. Romans 8:28.